Part 1. The Storm and the Cry. The wind came down from the mountains like something wild and hungry, carrying snow that cut through a man's coat as if it were made of paper. Cole Merrick pulled his hat lower and squinted through the white fury that had swallowed the world whole. February in Montana Territory was no time for mercy, and this storm had been building for 3 days, turning the sky the color of old pewter and promising worse to come. His cattle knew what was coming better than any almanac. The herd had been restless all morning, bunching together and lowing with that particular note that meant trouble. Cole had learned to listen to cattle the way other men listened to their wives, with attention born of necessity and the knowledge that ignoring them led to grief. "Easy now," he called to the stragglers, his voice nearly lost in the howl of wind. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Prudence, picked her way carefully through the deepening drifts. Snow had been falling since dawn, and now, with the sun somewhere behind the gray wall of clouds, it was coming down in earnest, the kind of snow that buried fences and turned familiar landmarks into white mysteries. Cole had spent the better part of 34 winters in this country, first as a boy following his father's herds, then as a man working other men's cattle, and finally these past 7 years on his own small spread in the shadow of the Bridger Mountains. He knew the signs. This storm would last through the night, maybe longer. The cattle needed to be in the shelter of the Box Canyon before full dark, or come morning he'd be counting losses instead of livestock. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontal now, and Cole felt Prudence shiver beneath him. Even she was feeling it, and she'd been born to this country. He turned in his saddle to count the herd one more time, 23 head, all there, and whistled sharp and low to move them along. His fingers, even inside thick leather gloves, were starting to lose feeling. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it did when it got up like this, moaning through the rocks and pines like something in pain. But there it was again, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, thin and desperate, barely audible above the gale. A human cry. Cole reined in Prudence and listened hard, his breath steaming in the frigid air. The cattle milled around him, impatient to reach shelter, but he held them there with a low whistle. The sound came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Someone was out in this storm, and they were in trouble. He looked toward the direction of the sound, northeast, toward the old fence line that marked where his land met the abandoned Hutchins place. That spread had been empty for 2 years now, ever since old Ben Hutchins died and his sons went back east with their inheritance. Nothing there now but falling down buildings and fence posts leaning at odd angles. The smart thing would be to get the cattle to safety first. Livestock represented money, and money meant survival through the winter. But the sound came again, weaker now, and Cole Merrick had never been accused of being smart when someone needed help. He pushed the herd toward the canyon mouth, where they'd shelter from the worst of it against the rock walls. They knew the way, and with the storm driving them, they'd go to ground on their own. Prudence danced sideways as he turned her toward the fence line, her ears flicking back to show what she thought of this idea. "I know, girl," he murmured, leaning forward to pat her neck. "But we can't leave whoever that is out here to freeze." The wind was stronger now, gusting hard enough to rock him in the saddle. Snow whipped around them in spirals, and the world had narrowed to what he could see in the space of a few yards. Prudence's hooves crunched through the crust, breaking through to the softer snow beneath with each step. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it in the way the wind bit through his clothes, and in how the snow was starting to squeak under the horse's weight. The fence line emerged from the white like a row of crooked teeth. Some of the posts had fallen over completely, their wire tangled and rusted. Cole followed it north, straining his ears for another sound, anything that would guide him. For a moment, there was nothing but the storm's voice, and he began to wonder if he'd imagined it all. Then he saw her. She was tied to one of the fence posts with what looked like barbed wire, her dark hair whipping in the wind, her dress, what was left of it, torn and stained with blood. Even through the driving snow, Cole could see she was hurt bad. Her hands were bound behind the post, her wrists dark with blood where the wire had cut deep. Her face was swollen, one eye nearly closed, and there was a gash across her forehead that had bled down her cheek and onto her torn collar. But it was her condition that made Cole's jaw clench tight with anger. Even bundled in the remains of a heavy coat, he could see the gentle swell of her belly. She was with child, maybe 5 or 6 months along, and someone had done this to her. Left her tied to a fence post in a blizzard like an animal marked for slaughter. She must have heard Prudence's approach because she lifted her head, and Cole saw her lips moving. No sound came out. She was too weak, too cold. But her eyes found his through the snow, and in them he saw something that made his chest tight. Not just fear or pain, though there was plenty of both. It was hope, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Cole was off his horse before he'd fully stopped, his boots punching through the snow crust. Up close, the damage was worse. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, showing purple bruises on pale skin. Her hands were nearly blue with cold, and the wire around her wrists had cut deep enough that blood had frozen in dark streaks down her arms. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentle as he'd used with a spooked horse. "I'm going to get you loose." She tried to speak, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold, but only managed a whisper he couldn't catch over the wind. Her eyes were gray as the storm clouds, and they followed his every movement as he pulled his knife from his belt. The wire was old and rusty, but it had been twisted tight. Cole worked carefully, trying not to jar her too much as he cut through the bonds. She whimpered when he lifted her hands free, and he could see why. The wire had bitten deep, and her wrists were a mess of cuts and torn skin. "Who did this to you?" he asked, though he kept his voice low and calm. She didn't answer, just shook her head slightly and closed her eyes. Cole shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then lifted her as gently as he could. She was lighter than she should be, even carrying a child, and he could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. When had she last eaten? How long had she been out here? Getting her onto Prudence took some doing. The mare stood steady as a rock. Bless her. While Cole managed to get the woman settled in front of him in the saddle. She slumped against his chest, unconscious now, and he could feel how cold she was even through his shirt. The ride back to his cabin seemed to take forever. The storm was getting worse, if such a thing was possible. And twice Cole had to stop and get his bearings when familiar landmarks disappeared in the white. The woman in his arms stirred once, mumbling something he couldn't make out, then went still again. By the time his cabin came into view through the snow, full dark had fallen, and the wind was howling like all the demons of hell were loose in the world. The small building looked like salvation itself, its log walls solid and reassuring after the chaos of the storm. Cole managed to get the woman inside and settled in the chair by the cold fireplace before seeing to Prudence. The horse needed shelter too, and there was no point in saving one life only to lose another to the cold. He led her to the lean-to behind the cabin, rubbed her down quick, and made sure she had hay and water before hurrying back inside. The cabin felt warm only by comparison to the storm outside. His fire had died to cold ashes hours ago, and frost was starting to form on the inside of the windows. Cole got kindling going first, then bigger pieces, until flames were dancing in the hearth and throwing welcome light across the room. Only then did he get a proper look at what he'd brought home. She was young, maybe 20 or so, with dark brown hair that would probably be pretty when it wasn't tangled with snow and blood. Her face, beneath the bruises and cuts, had good bones and a stubborn chin that spoke of character. Her dress had once been blue, he thought, though it was hard to tell through the dirt and tears. Someone had hurt her bad, and recently. The bruises on her face were fresh, maybe a day or two old, and the cuts on her wrists were still seeping blood despite the cold. But it was the careful way she held herself, even unconscious, that told him the worst of it. Someone had beaten a pregnant woman and left her to die in a blizzard. Cole Merrick had seen a lot of hard things in his life. The frontier didn't coddle anyone, and he'd learned early that the world could be cruel as winter and twice as unforgiving. But this made something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. Whatever had happened to this woman, whoever had done it, they'd crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. He heated water on the stove and found clean rags, then set about cleaning her wounds as gently as he could. She stirred when he touched the cut on her forehead, her eyes fluttering open to focus on his face. "Where?" she whispered, her voice like paper rustling. "My cabin," Cole said, keeping his voice soft. "You're safe now. What's your name?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to remember, then closed her eyes. "Annie," she said finally. Annie Calder. "Well, Miss Calder," Cole said, dabbing at the blood on her temple with careful fingers. "You're going to be all right. No one's going to hurt you here." Her eyes opened again, and in them he saw something that broke his heart a little. Disbelief. As if the idea of safety was something she'd forgotten how to trust. Outside, the storm raged on, shaking the cabin walls and howling down the chimney. But inside, the fire was burning bright and warm, and Cole Merrick had work to do. He had a woman to heal, questions that needed answers. And if he was reading the signs right, trouble that was likely coming with the dawn. But for now, in this moment, Annie Calder was safe. And that was enough to start with. Part 2, the first fire. The cabin had been built for one man living alone, and it showed. Cole's few possessions were scattered about with the careless order of someone who never expected company. A spare shirt hanging from a peg by the door. Books stacked on the rough pine table alongside leather-working tools. A half-finished bridle draped over the back of his only other chair. The place smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint mustiness that came from a dwelling that spent most of its time empty while its owner worked the range. Annie had drifted back into unconsciousness while he cleaned her wounds, which was probably a mercy. The cut on her forehead had taken 6 careful stitches with thread meant for mending saddles, and her wrists would need time to heal proper. The worst of it, though, was what he could see in the set of her shoulders even while she slept, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow to fall. Cole banked the fire to burn steady through the night, then set about making the cabin more fit for a woman's presence. He moved his clothes from the bedroom and made up his narrow bed with the cleanest sheets he could find. The mattress was nothing fancy, corn husks and old blankets, but it was dry and warm, and that was what mattered now. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had gotten worse. Rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling down the chimney to hiss against the hot stones. Cole had weathered plenty of Montana blizzards in this cabin, but tonight the wind sounded different, wilder, more desperate, as if it too knew what had happened out there in the white. He put water onto heat and rummaged through his stores, looking for something that would put some strength back into Annie without being too hard on a stomach that had likely been empty too long. He had beans and salt pork, hardtack and coffee, the usual fare of a man who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. but tucked away in the back of his provisions, he found a jar of honey his neighbor Ezra Whitmore had given him last fall, and some oats that would make a decent porridge. Annie stirred when the smell of cooking food began to fill the cabin. Her eyes opened slowly, taking in the low-beamed ceiling, the simple furniture, the way the firelight danced across the chinked log walls. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as if she couldn't quite remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. "You're safe," Cole said quietly, not turning from the stove. He'd learned that frightened things often spooked when you looked at them direct. "Storm's still blowing, but we're warm and dry." She tried to sit up straighter in the chair, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. "I don't. How did I—" "He found you tied to a fence post about 2 miles north of here," Cole said, stirring honey into the bowl of porridge. "Been wondering who'd do such a thing to a woman, especially one in your condition." The color drained from Annie's face at his words, and her hand moved instinctively to her belly. The gesture was protective, tender, and it told Cole more about her character than words might have. Whatever had happened to her, she was thinking of the child first. "I should go," she whispered, though she made no move to rise. "They might come looking." "In this storm?" Cole shook his head, bringing the bowl over to where she sat. "Nobody's traveling tonight except maybe the angels, and I doubt they'd brave weather like this. Besides, where would you go?" Annie stared down at the bowl he placed in her hands as if she'd never seen food before. The porridge was simple fare, but it was hot and sweet with honey, and after a moment's hesitation, she began to eat with the careful hunger of someone who'd learned not to take sustenance for granted. Cole settled into the other chair and watched her eat, noting the way she kept glancing toward the door and windows. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" 3 days, maybe 4. Her voice was stronger now, though still soft. "Hard to keep track. And the people who did this to you, they from around here?" Annie's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, and Cole saw her shoulders tense. "Please," she said. "I can't." "Not tonight." He nodded, understanding. There were some stories that needed time before they could be told, some wounds that went deeper than what showed on the surface. "Fair enough, but when you're ready to talk, I'll listen." They sat in comfortable silence while she finished the porridge. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and snow continued to pile against the windows. Cole added another log to the fire and checked the pot of water he was keeping warm. Annie would need to wash properly, and he had clean clothes that could be made to fit her well enough until something better could be arranged. "Why?" Annie asked suddenly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Why what? Why help me? You don't know me, don't know what I've done or why they—" She gestured vaguely toward her injuries. Cole considered the question, really considered it. He could have said it was simple Christian duty, or that no decent man left a woman to freeze in a blizzard. Both would have been true, but they wouldn't have been the whole truth. "My mother," he said finally. "She died when I was 12, giving birth to what would have been my brother. Lost them both in the space of an hour." He stared into the fire, remembering. My father, he blamed her somehow. Said if she'd been a better woman, God wouldn't have taken her. Said things about her that weren't true, weren't fair. I swore then that I'd never stand by and watch a woman suffer if there was something I could do about it. Annie's eyes glistened with tears she didn't let fall. "I'm sorry. A long time ago now," Cole said, though the memory still had teeth. "Point is, whatever brought you to that fence post, whatever folks might say about your situation, it doesn't change what's right. You're a woman in need of help, and you're carrying a child. That's all that matters to me." The simple certainty in his voice seemed to break something loose in Annie's chest. She set down the empty bowl and covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Cole wanted to comfort her somehow, but he'd learned that sometimes people needed to cry like the land needed rain, hard and cleansing, washing away what couldn't be carried anymore. When the tears finally stopped, Annie looked up at him with something like wonder in her gray eyes. "You really mean that?" "I do." She nodded slowly, as if testing the weight of his words and finding them solid. "I should tell you my story. You deserve to know what kind of trouble you might be bringing on yourself. Only if you want to," Cole said, "and only when you're ready." Annie pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. She was still wearing it, and it dwarfed her small frame. I think I'd like to get cleaned up first. If that's all right." Cole nodded and rose to his feet. "I've got water warming, and there's soap and clean clothes. The bedroom's yours for as long as you need it." He paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame. "Annie?" "Yes?" "You're safe here," he said, and the quiet conviction in his voice made it sound like a promise. "Whatever comes, you're safe here while I'm breathing." He left her then, stepping out into the storm to check on Prudence and give Annie the privacy she needed. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face and stealing his breath. But even in the fury of the blizzard, he could see the warm glow of lamplight from his cabin windows. And it occurred to him that the place had never looked more like home than it did right now, with someone inside worth protecting. When he returned 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his hat, Annie had washed and changed into one of his old shirts and a pair of pants that she'd somehow made fit with careful folding in his spare belt. Her hair, clean now and braided back, was a rich brown that caught the firelight, and though her face still bore the marks of her ordeal, there was something different about her bearing. Straighter, more resolved. "It better?" he asked. "Much." She'd made coffee while he was outside, and the cabin smelled of chicory and wood smoke. "I used your shirt and pants. I hope that's all right." "Of course it is. Probably more practical anyway, considering—" Annie settled back into the chair by the fire, cradling a cup of coffee in both hands. "Cole?" "Yes?" "Thank you, not just for saving me, but for making me feel human again." Cole felt something twist in his chest at her words. How long, he wondered, had it been since someone had shown her simple kindness? How far had she fallen that a warm meal and clean clothes felt like salvation? "You want to tell me about it now?" he asked gently. Annie stared into the fire for a long moment, as if gathering her courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but Cole could hear the pain underneath it like rocks hidden beneath still water. "I worked for the Bridgewater family in town," she began. "Cooking, cleaning, caring for their children. They seemed like good people, God-fearing folk. Mrs. Van Bridgewater was kind to me, and their children were sweet." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "There was a man, Thomas Garrett. He worked at the bank, came by the house on business sometimes. He was charming, said things that made me feel special, important, said he loved me, wanted to marry me." Cole could guess where this was heading, but he kept his expression neutral and let her tell it in her own time. "When I told him about the baby," Annie continued, her voice growing smaller, "he changed, said I was mistaken about his intentions, that he'd never promised marriage, said if I told anyone he was the father, he'd make sure I never worked in town again." The anger that had been simmering in Cole's chest began to burn hotter, but he kept it from his voice. "And the Bridgewaters? When I couldn't hide the pregnancy anymore, Mrs. Bridgewater asked me about it. I told her the truth, that I'd been foolish, that the father had abandoned us. She was sympathetic at first, said she'd help me find work elsewhere. But then her husband found out. Annie's hands tightened around the coffee cup. Mr. Bridgewater said I was a corrupting influence on his household, said decent folks couldn't have someone like me around their children. He gave me a week to find somewhere else to go. But word had gotten around town by then. No one would hire me, and the few places that might have taken me in, they had conditions I couldn't accept. Cole's jaw clenched. He could imagine what kinds of conditions those would have been. I was sleeping in the church cellar, Annie went on, her voice barely above a whisper. Reverend Hayes knew, but he didn't say anything as long as I was gone before morning services. But someone must have told the Bridgewaters, because yesterday morning Mr. Bridgewater and 2 other men came to drag me out. Said I was a disgrace to decent people, that I needed to be taught a lesson about the consequences of sin. She stopped then, and Cole could see her struggling with the memory. They took me to that fence line, she said finally. Said they were going to let God decide whether I deserved to live or die. Tied me up and left me there. Her voice broke slightly. I thought that was the end. For me and for the baby. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotion. Cole stared into the fire, his hands clenched into fists. The men who had done this, they lived in town, walked among decent people, probably sat in church on Sundays and called themselves righteous. The thought made him sick. Well, he said finally, his voice rough with controlled anger. God decided, didn't he? He sent a storm to cover your trail and led me to that fence post. I'd say that's a pretty clear judgment. Annie looked at him with something like amazement. You really believe that? I believe that anyone who'd tie a pregnant woman to a fence post in a blizzard doesn't get to speak for the Almighty, Cole said firmly. And I believe that you and that baby deserve better than what this world's given you so far. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin something had settled between them, an understanding, a trust beginning to form. Annie sipped her coffee and watched the fire, and for the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Cole stood and moved to the window, peering out through the frost at the white wall of the storm. This weather should hold them for a day or 2 at least, he said. Give us time to figure out what comes next. Us, Annie asked softly. Cole turned back to her, and in the firelight, his face was all hard angles and quiet determination. Like I said before, you're safe here. That includes making sure you stay safe. Annie felt tears threaten again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks, Cole said. But you should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll need to make some decisions. He helped her to the bedroom, where the narrow bed looked like luxury after nights on a church floor. As he turned to leave, Annie caught his sleeve. Cole? Yes? When you found me out there, why did you risk the storm? Most people would have waited until it passed. Cole looked down at her for a long moment. This small, brave woman who'd been through hell and somehow found the strength to keep fighting for her child's life. Because, he said simply, some things are worth the risk. He left her then, settling into the chair by the dying fire to keep watch through the night. Outside, the storm howled and raged, but inside, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cole Merrick's cabin felt like home. Part 3, Stories by Firelight. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed. When Cole stepped outside the next morning to tend to Prudence and check his traps, the silence was profound, the kind of absolute quiet that came only after nature had spent its fury. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the drifts, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that caught the pale morning light and threw it back in sparkles of blue and silver. Annie was still sleeping when he returned, curled beneath the heavy quilt in his narrow bed. The cuts on her face looked better in daylight, less angry, though the bruising had darkened to deep purples and yellows. Her breathing was steady and peaceful, and for the first time since he'd found her tied to that fence post. She looked young, vulnerable in the way that reminded him she was hardly more than a girl herself. Despite everything she'd endured, Cole set coffee to brewing and fried up some eggs from his small flock of hens, grateful that the birds had weathered the storm without loss. The smell of bacon cooking in the iron skillet filled the cabin with homely warmth, and by the time Annie stirred and made her way to the main room, the morning meal was ready. She moved carefully, favoring her left side where the bruises were worst, but there was more color in her cheeks than there had been the night before. She'd braided her hair back neat and clean, and in Cole's oversized shirt and rolled-up pants, she looked like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. "Morning," she said softly, accepting the plate he offered her. "Thank you. For everything." "No need for thanks," Cole replied, settling into his chair with his own breakfast. "How are you feeling?" "Better." She took a small bite of egg, then another, larger one. "Much better. I think I was more tired than I realized." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the morning sun streaming through the frost-etched windows and warming the cabin. Outside, Cole could hear the distant lowing of his cattle, scattered but safe in the box canyon where they'd weathered the storm. The sound was reassuring, life going on as it should, despite the violence that had brought Annie to his door. "Cole?" Annie's voice was tentative, uncertain. "Yes?" "Last night, when I told you about what happened, you didn't ask me about the baby's father." Cole set down his coffee cup and studied her face. There was something in her expression, not quite fear, but a wariness that spoke of judgments already rendered, of questions asked with cruelty rather than kindness. "He figured if you wanted to tell me, you would," he said simply. "Not really my business otherwise." "Most people would say it was their business," Annie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most people have had plenty to say about it." "Most people weren't raised right, then." The simple certainty in his voice seemed to surprise her. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand how such a thing could be possible. "You really mean that?" "I do." Cole reached for the coffee pot and refilled both their cups. "But if you want to talk about it, I'll listen. Sometimes carrying a burden alone makes it heavier than it needs to be." Annie wrapped her hands around the warm cup and stared into the dark liquid. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but Cole could hear the old pain underneath it. "His name was Thomas Garrett," she began. "He worked at the Bridgewater Bank in town. Still does, I suppose. He was charming, handsome, the kind of man who could make a girl feel special just by talking to her." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "I was working for the Bridgewater family then. Had been for almost 2 years. It was good work. Mrs. Bridgewater was kind, and their children were sweet. I had my own little room in the attic, steady wages, 3 meals a day. More than I'd had growing up." Cole nodded but didn't interrupt. There was something about the careful way she was telling this that suggested she needed to get it all out, to speak the words that had been locked inside her for too long. "Thomas started coming around more often than his banking business required," Annie continued. "He'd find excuses to stay for dinner, to talk with me in the kitchen while I was working. He brought me books, little gifts, Told me I was too intelligent to be just a servant girl, that I deserved better. The bitterness in her voice made Cole's jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. He said he loved me, Annie said so quietly he had to lean forward to hear her. Said he wanted to marry me, that we'd have a good life together. He talked about a house of our own, children, the kind of future I'd never dared dream about. She fell silent for a moment, lost in memory. Outside, a crow cawed harshly, and snow began to slide from the cabin roof in small avalanches. I believed him, Annie said finally. The Lord help me, I believed every word, and when we... She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. You don't need to explain that part, Cole said gently. Annie shot him a grateful look. When I told him about the baby, everything changed. It was like talking to a stranger. He said I'd misunderstood his intentions, that he'd never promised marriage. Said if I told anyone he was the father, he'd make sure I never worked anywhere in the territory again. The anger that had been simmering in Cole's chest began to burn hotter. He'd known men like Thomas Garrett, smooth-talking predators who took what they wanted and left others to pay the price. And Mrs. Bridgewater? He asked. At first she was kind, said she understood that young women sometimes made mistakes, that she'd help me find work elsewhere when the time came. But when her husband found out... Annie's voice trailed off. He was less understanding. He called me a corrupting influence. Said decent people couldn't have someone like me around their children. That my condition was evidence of moral failing that might spread to his daughters. Annie's hands trembled slightly around the coffee cup. He gave me a week to find somewhere else to go. Cole felt his fists clench under the table. And Thomas Garrett just let this happen? Thomas acted like he'd never seen me before in his life. When I tried to approach him outside the bank, he had me escorted away by the sheriff. Said I was bothering respectable citizens with false accusations. The picture was becoming clearer now, and Cole didn't like what he was seeing. A young woman, alone and pregnant, abandoned by the man who'd fathered her child and cast out by the people she'd served faithfully. In a small town. That would have been a death sentence to her reputation. And in Montana Territory in 1882, a woman's reputation was often all that stood between her and destitution. Where did you go? He asked. Nowhere, really. I tried to find work, but word had gotten around. The only places that would consider hiring me. She stopped, shaking her head. I couldn't accept their conditions, not for me, and not for my baby. Cole could imagine what those conditions might have been. There were always men willing to take advantage of a desperate woman, and establishments that catered to such arrangements. I ended up sleeping in the church cellar, Annie continued. Reverend Hayes knew, but he looked the other way as long as I was gone before the congregation arrived for services. It wasn't much, but it was dry and warm, and I thought maybe I could manage until the baby came. What changed? Annie's face darkened. Someone told the Bridgewaters where I was staying. Maybe they felt guilty about casting me out, or maybe they just wanted to make sure I was gone for good. Yesterday morning, Mr. Bridgewater came with 2 other men, Harold Kemp from the dry goods store and Samuel Morrison, who runs the livery stable. The names meant nothing to Cole, but he filed them away for future reference. They dragged me out of the church, Annie said, her voice growing smaller. Said I was a disgrace to decent people, that my presence was an insult to God's house. Said I needed to learn about the consequences of sin. And they took you to the fence line. Annie nodded, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. They tied me there and left me. Said they were letting God decide whether I deserved to live or die. Mr. Bridgewater said if I survived the storm, It would be a sign that the Lord wanted me to repent and change my ways, and if I didn't... She shrugged helplessly. Cole felt something cold and dangerous settle in his stomach. What these men had done wasn't justice, it was attempted murder, pure and simple. They'd tied a pregnant woman to a fence post in a blizzard and called it God's will. "How long were you out there?" he asked. "I don't know. It felt like forever." The storm kept getting worse, and I kept thinking about my baby, wondering if this was how we'd both die. I prayed. Cole. I prayed harder than I ever had in my life, not for myself, but for the child. This baby never did anything wrong. It shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes. Cole reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You didn't make any mistakes, Annie. You trusted someone who wasn't worthy of it. That's not a sin. That's being human." Annie stared at him through her tears. "You really believe that?" "I believe that what happened to you was wrong. I believe that the men who did it are cowards who hide their cruelty behind religion. And I believe that you and your baby deserve better than what this world has given you so far." The conviction in his voice seemed to calm something in Annie's chest. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and managed a small smile. "When I saw you coming through the snow," she said, "I thought I was dreaming, or maybe dying and seeing angels. You looked so solid, so real, cutting through that storm like it was nothing." "Just a man doing what needed doing," Cole said, but there was warmth in his voice. "No," Annie said firmly. "You're more than that. You saved us, me and my baby. You brought me into your home, fed me, cared for my wounds, listened to my story without judgment. That's not just what any man would do. That's what a good man does." Cole felt heat rise in his cheeks at her words. He wasn't used to praise, especially from someone who'd been through what Annie had endured. "The question now," he said, changing the subject, "is what comes next. Those men who left you out there, they're going to know you survived when this storm clears enough for travel. They might come looking." Annie's face went pale. "I hadn't thought of that. Oh God, what if they come here? I've brought trouble to your door, haven't I? The only trouble is the trouble they brought when they decided to act like animals instead of men," Cole said firmly. "But we need to be prepared. This cabin's isolated enough that they might not think to look here right away. But word gets around. Someone will remember seeing tracks, or wonder where you've gone." "I should leave," Annie said, starting to rise from her chair. "I should go somewhere else. Somewhere they won't think to look." "Sit down," Cole said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not going anywhere in your condition, especially not in this weather. Besides, running won't solve anything. These men need to face consequences for what they did." "Who's going to make them face consequences?" Annie asked bitterly. "They're respected members of the community. Mr. Bridgewater owns half the businesses in town. Who's going to believe the word of a fallen woman against theirs?" Cole was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, but there was something in it that made Annie sit up straighter. "There's more than one kind of justice in this world," he said, "and more than one way to make sure people face the consequences of their actions." "What do you mean?" Cole looked at her then, and Annie saw something in his eyes that was both reassuring and slightly frightening, the kind of quiet resolve that suggested he was capable of things she might not have imagined. "I mean," he said carefully, "that you're under my protection now. Anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me first. And I've been known to be unreasonable when it comes to protecting what's mine." "What's yours?" Annie whispered. Cole realized what he'd said and felt heat rise in his cheeks again. What I mean is..." He stopped, took a breath, and started over. "Annie, I know we've only just met, and I know you've got no reason to trust any man right now. But if you'll have it, I'd like to offer you something those men in town can't take away." "What's that?" Cole got up from the table and walked to a shelf near the window, where he kept his few books and papers. He pulled out a sheet of paper and a pencil, then returned to the table. Annie watched, curious, as he began to write. "My name," he said simply, not looking up from the paper. "If you want it." Annie's breath caught in her throat. "Cole, you can't. You don't even know me." "Not really." "I know enough," he said, still writing. "I know you're brave enough to protect your child even when you thought you were dying. I know you're honest enough to tell me your story even when it painted you in a bad light. I know you're strong enough to survive what would have broken most people." He finished writing and turned the paper toward her. In his careful script, he'd written, "Mrs. Annie Merrick." "It's not a proposal," he said quickly, seeing the shock in her eyes. "Not exactly. It's an offer of protection, a legal arrangement that would give you status, give your child a name, give both of you a place in the world that no one can take away." And he stared at the paper, then at his face. "You'd do that? For me? For us?" "I would." "But why? What would you get out of it?" Cole considered the question seriously. "Company, I suppose, purpose. This cabin's been pretty empty these past few years. Might be nice to have someone to cook for besides myself, someone to talk to in the evenings. And when the baby comes—" He paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Well, I always wondered what it would be like to have a family." Annie felt tears starting again, but these were different. Tears of gratitude, of hope, of something she was afraid to name. "You'd really want that?" she asked. "Even knowing what people would say, even knowing the trouble it might bring?" Cole reached across the table and took her hand again. "Annie Calder," he said, his voice low and serious. "I've spent my whole life not much caring what people said about me. I'm not about to start now. As for trouble, well, I've handled trouble before." Outside, the wind had picked up again, sending snow swirling past the windows. But inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, something was blooming between them. Not love, not yet, but the seeds of it. Trust, respect, and the kind of partnership that could grow into something deeper with time. "I don't know what to say," Annie whispered. "Say you'll think about it," Cole said. "No pressure, no rush. Just consider it. Consider the possibility that maybe God didn't send that storm to kill you. Maybe he sent it to bring you here." Annie looked at the paper again, at the name written there in Cole's steady hand. Mrs. Annie Merrick. It looked real, solid, like something she could build a life on. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Cole nodded and carefully folded the paper, setting it on the shelf beside his books. "That's all I ask." Outside, the storm was building again, and the afternoon light was fading fast. But inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and bright, and for the first time in months, Annie Calder allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story might have a happy ending after all. Part 4, Shadows Drawing Near. 3 days passed in deceptive peace. The storm had blown itself out, leaving the world buried under pristine snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the weak February sun. Cole went about his usual routines, tending the cattle, checking his trap lines, splitting wood for the fire, but with a heightened awareness that hadn't been there before. Every distant sound made him pause. Every moving shadow on the horizon drew his careful attention. Annie grew stronger each day. The cuts on her face were healing clean, and though the bruises had darkened to spectacular purples and yellows before beginning to fade, she moved with less pain. She insisted on helping with the cooking and mending, her capable hands bringing a woman's touch to the rough bachelor quarters that Cole had never realized he was missing. She was making breakfast on the fourth morning when the sound of hoofbeats broke the winter silence. Cole's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester he now kept propped by the door. But the approaching horse was familiar, his neighbor Millicent Whitmore's gray gelding, picking his way carefully through the snowdrifts. "Millie," Cole called out, stepping onto the porch as the sturdy woman dismounted. At 63, Millicent Whitmore was tougher than most men half her age, with steel-gray hair always pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of winter sky. She'd homesteaded the spread 3 miles east with her late husband, and after his death 5 years ago, she'd run it alone with the kind of grit that commanded respect throughout the territory. "Hey, Cole Merrick," she said, her breath steaming in the cold air. "We need to talk." Something in her tone made Cole's stomach tighten. Millie wasn't one for social calls, especially not in weather like this. "Come in," he said. "Coffee's on." Millie followed him inside, stamping snow from her boots. She nodded politely to Annie, who was standing by the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, but Cole could see the curiosity in the older woman's eyes. News traveled fast in isolated country, and any change in routine was noted and discussed. "Miss Annie Calder," Cole said carefully. "I'd like you to meet my neighbor, Mrs. Millicent Whitmore. Millie, this is Annie. She's been staying here since the storm." Millie's sharp eyes took in Annie's healing bruises, the way she unconsciously held one hand over her belly, the careful distance she maintained from the doorway. The older woman had seen enough of life to read the signs. "Pleased to meet you, dear," Millie said, her voice gentling. "That was quite a storm we had. Lucky you found shelter." "Yes, ma'am," Annie replied softly. "Mr. Merrick was very kind." Millie accepted the cup of coffee Cole offered her and settled into one of the chairs. "I came to warn you, Cole," she said without preamble. "There's been talk in town." Cole felt the muscles in his shoulders tense. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that usually leads to trouble." Millie took a sip of coffee and studied his face. "Seems someone's been spreading word that a certain young woman has gone missing from town. Same young woman who was supposed to have learned a lesson about proper behavior." Annie went pale, and the wooden spoon clattered to the floor. Cole moved to steady her, his hand gentle on her arm. "What exactly are they saying?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Harlan Bridgewater's been telling anyone who'll listen that Annie here stole money from his household before disappearing into the storm," Millie said, her voice flat with disgust. "Claims she took advantage of their Christian charity and repaid it with theft." "That's not true," Annie gasped. "I never took anything from them except what was owed to me in wages, and they paid me short even on that." "I believe you, child," Millie said firmly. "But Bridgewater's got influence in town, and he's using it. He's convinced the sheriff that you're a thief as well as everything else he's been saying about your character." Cole's jaw tightened. "Sheriff Dawson's bought into this?" "Dawson's always been in Bridgewater's pocket," Millie replied. "You know that. Bridgewater owns the bank that holds the mortgage on Dawson's house, and half the businesses that keep this town running. When Harlan Bridgewater says jump, most folks ask how high." Cole began to pace, his mind working through the implications. If Bridgewater had convinced the sheriff that Annie was a thief, he could have her arrested on sight, and in a territory where justice often moved faster than due process. A pregnant woman with a damaged reputation would have little chance of a fair hearing. "There's more," Millie continued grimly. "Bridgewater's put together a search party. Says it's his Christian duty to bring a thief to justice. But from what I hear, Some of the men he's recruited aren't the type who worry overmuch about bringing folks back alive. Annie sank into a chair, her face white as the snow outside. They're coming here? Not yet, Millie said. But it's only a matter of time. They've been checking the abandoned homesteads first, places where someone might hole up. But once they've exhausted those options, they'll start checking with the neighbors, Cole finished. And this place isn't exactly hidden. Millie nodded. I'd say you've got maybe a day, 2 at most, before they think to ride out this way. Cole stopped pacing and looked at Annie, seeing the fear in her gray eyes, but also something else, a quiet resolve that spoke to her inner strength. She'd survived being tied to a fence post in a blizzard. She wouldn't break easily under this new threat. What do you recommend? He asked Millie. The older woman was quiet for a moment, considering. Well, you could send her away. There are places she could go, people who might take her in without asking too many questions. My sister in Denver, for instance. No, Cole said immediately. She's not well enough to travel that far, especially not in her condition. And I won't send her out into the world alone to face whatever comes. Millie's eyebrows rose slightly. Then you'd better be prepared for what that means. Cole. Standing against Harlan Bridgewater isn't something a man does lightly in this territory. I know exactly what it means, Cole replied, his voice steady, and I'm prepared for it. Annie looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Cole, you can't put yourself at risk for me. These men, they've already shown what they're capable of. I won't have your blood on my hands, too. The only blood on anyone's hands will be theirs, Cole said grimly. And only if they force the issue. Millie studied both of their faces, reading the dynamics between them with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to understand human nature. There might be another way, she said slowly. What do you mean? Annie asked. Well, the charges Bridgewater's making are against Annie Calder, unmarried woman of questionable virtue, Millie said. But if Annie Calder were to become, say, Annie Merrick, legally wed and under her husband's protection, that would change things considerably. Cole felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he met Millie's knowing gaze steadily. I've already made that offer, he said. And I haven't given him an answer, Annie said softly. Millie leaned forward in her chair. Child, I don't know what happened to you in town, and I don't need to know. But I can see with my own eyes that you're a decent woman in a bad situation. And I've known Cole Merrick since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. He's a good man, an honorable man. You could do a lot worse. It's not about whether he's a good man, Annie said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about whether it's fair to ask him to take on someone else's troubles, someone else's child. Seems to me, Millie said dryly. That's Cole's decision to make. Cole moved to the window and peered out at the snow-covered landscape. The sun was climbing higher, and the pristine white was beginning to show dark patches where the snow was melting. Travel would be easier now, which meant their pursuers would be moving faster. How much time do we have? He asked without turning around. If I had to guess, I'd say they'll be here tomorrow, Millie replied. Maybe the day after if the weather turns bad again. Cole nodded, his mind made up. He turned back to face Annie, his expression serious but not unkind. Annie, I meant what I said before. The offer stands, no matter what you decide. But if you're going to accept it, it needs to be now. Once those men get here, our options become limited. Annie stared at him for a long moment, then at Millie, who was watching her with grandmotherly concern. Finally, she looked down at her hands, folded protectively over her belly. The baby, she said softly. Would you really claim it as your own? I would, Cole said without hesitation. And not just claim it. I'd raise it, protect it, love it like my own blood. That child would want for nothing as long as I'm alive. Annie's eyes filled with tears. And you'd never throw it in my face? Never remind me that I came to you with nothing? Cole crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Annie, listen to me. Whatever happened before, whatever brought you to that fence post, it doesn't matter. What matters is what we do from here. And if you'll have me, I promise you'll never have cause to regret it. Millie cleared her throat delicately. If you two are going to do this thing, we need to do it properly. And that means getting Reverend Hayes out here to perform the ceremony. Reverend Hayes won't come, Annie said bitterly. He's the one who let me sleep in his church cellar, but he won't stand up to the Bridgewaters. He will if I ask him, Millie said firmly. James Hayes owes me more favors than he can count. And more importantly, he's a better man than his recent actions would suggest. Sometimes good people just need reminding of what's right. Cole squeezed Annie's hands gently. What do you say? Will you trust me with your future? With your child's future? Annie looked into his eyes, seeing the quiet strength there, the genuine care, the kind of steadiness that she'd never known in any man before. Thomas Garrett had been charming and smooth-talking, but there had always been something hollow beneath the surface. Cole Merrick was different, solid as bedrock, honest as sunlight. Yes, she whispered, yes, I'll marry you. Cole felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. You sure? Annie managed a small smile. I'm sure, God help us both, but I'm sure. Millie slapped her hands on her knees and stood up. Well then, we'd better get moving. I'll ride back to town and fetch Reverend Hayes. With any luck, we can have this done before sunset. What about the search party? Cole asked. They won't move until tomorrow at the earliest. Millie said. Bridgewater's too comfortable in his warm parlor to go riding around in this weather unless he absolutely has to. But by tomorrow night, you'll be legally married, and Annie will be under your protection as your wife. That changes everything. Cole nodded, already thinking ahead to what needed to be done. I'll need to prepare the cabin. Make sure we have everything we need if they do come calling. They'll come calling, all right, Millie said grimly. But they'll think twice about tangling with a man defending his wife and home, especially a man with your reputation. Annie looked between them, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. What reputation? Cole looked uncomfortable. Nothing important. Cole Merrick's too modest, Millie said with a slight smile. But let's just say that before he settled down to ranching, he had occasion to demonstrate that he's not a man to be trifled with. Word gets around in country like this. Annie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She was beginning to understand that the quiet, gentle man who'd saved her life might be capable of things she hadn't imagined. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me, she said. And no one will, if these men have any sense, Cole replied. But if they choose to force the issue, that's on them, not you. Millie was already putting on her coat. I'll be back before evening with Reverend Hayes. Annie, do you have anything suitable to wear for a wedding? Annie looked down at Cole's oversized shirt and rolled up pants. Not really. I've got a dress that might fit, Millie said. One simple blue wool, nothing fancy, but clean and decent. I'll bring it with me. She paused at the door, looking back at both of them. This is the right thing you're doing, she said firmly. Don't let anyone tell you different. After she left, Cole and Annie sat in awkward silence for a while. The magnitude of what they'd just committed to was settling in, and both of them seemed uncertain how to proceed. Are you having second thoughts? Cole asked finally. A few hundred of them, Annie admitted. But not about marrying you. About About what comes after. I don't know how to be a wife, Cole, not a proper one. I don't know how to be a husband either, Cole said with a slight smile. Guess we'll figure it out together. Annie looked around the cabin that would soon be her home, really her home, for the first time in her life. It was rough and simple, but it was warm and solid and safe. More than that, it was offered freely, without conditions or expectations beyond basic human decency. You, Cole, she said softly. Yes? Thank you, not just for this, for the marriage, but for making me feel like I'm worth saving. Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion. Annie, you were always worth saving. It just took someone with sense to see it. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the snow and bringing the promise of spring. But inside the cabin, two people sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of the future they were about to build together, and the dangers they would soon face side by side. By evening, Annie Calder would be Annie Merrick, and by tomorrow, they would learn whether that change was enough to protect them from the storm that was coming. Part 5, the night of confrontation. The wedding had been simple, conducted by lamplight in Cole's small cabin as the sun set behind the mountains. Reverend James Hayes had arrived with Millicent Whitmore just before dusk, the elderly minister looking uncomfortable but determined. He was a thin man with kind eyes and graying hair, worn down by years of trying to balance his conscience with the political realities of serving a frontier congregation. I should have done this sooner, he'd confessed to Annie while Cole and Millie prepared the cabin. Should have stood up for you when they came to my church. A man of God has no business turning away from suffering, no matter what the town elders might say. Annie had worn Millie's blue wool dress. Simple but clean, with her dark hair braided and pinned up. Cole had found his best shirt and jacket, brushed the dust from his only good hat. They'd stood before the fire while Reverend Hayes spoke the familiar words. Their hands joined, their voices steady as they made promises that carried more weight than either had expected. Do you, Cole Merrick, take Annie to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. And do you, Annie Calder, take Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Annie had looked into Cole's steady brown eyes, seeing the quiet strength there, the genuine care, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months. Safety. I do. The kiss that sealed their union had been brief and gentle, more promise than passion, but it had felt right, real, like the beginning of something that could grow into everything she'd once dreamed of having. Millie had stayed for a simple supper, regaling them with stories of her early days in the territory while Reverend Hayes ate quietly, still clearly troubled by the circumstances that had brought them all together. As the evening wore on, he'd pulled Cole aside. Son, I need you to understand what you've taken on. The minister had said in a low voice, Harlan Bridgewater isn't a man to cross lightly. He's got influence, money, and friends in high places. This marriage will protect Annie legally, but it might not be enough to stop him if he's truly determined to make trouble. Let me worry about Bridgewater, Cole had replied, his voice carrying an edge that made the older man study his face more carefully. There's something else, Reverend Hayes had continued. Something you should know. The men who left Annie at that fence post, they've been saying she died in the storm, been acting like it was a tragedy, a cautionary tale about the wages of sin. If she shows up in town as your wife, it's going to cause quite a stir. Cole had nodded grimly. I figured as much, that's why she won't be going to town. Not for a while, anyway. Now, as Cole secured the cabin for the night, checking the Winchester propped by the door and making sure the shutters were latched tight, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. He was a married man now, with a wife sleeping in the bedroom and a child on the way that would carry his name. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Annie had retired early, exhausted by the emotions of the day. Cole had insisted she take the bedroom while he made do with a bedroll by the fire. It wasn't proper for a new husband and wife to sleep apart, but nothing about their situation was conventional, and Annie needed time to adjust to her new circumstances. He was banking the fire when he heard it, the distant sound of horses moving through the snow. Multiple horses, traveling slowly but with purpose. Cole's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, and he moved to the window, peering out through a gap in the shutters. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, their dark shapes visible against the moonlit snow. Even at a distance, Cole could see they were armed, and something about the way they rode, spread out, alert, predatory, told him this wasn't a social call. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded, then moved quietly to the bedroom door. "Annie," he called softly. "Annie, wake up." She stirred immediately, still attuned to danger after her ordeal. "What is it?" "We've got company. 3 riders coming up the valley. I need you to get dressed and stay away from the windows." Annie was out of bed and reaching for her clothes before he'd finished speaking. "Is it them?" "Can't tell yet, but we need to be ready." Cole moved back to the window, watching as the riders drew closer. "There's a back door that leads to the root cellar. If things go bad, I want you to go through there and follow the creek bed north until you reach Millie's place. I'm not leaving you. Annie, you're my wife now, which means protecting you is my job, and protecting that baby is both our jobs. If I tell you to run, you run." The riders were close enough now that Cole could make out individual faces in the moonlight. The man in the lead was tall and well-dressed, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed. Even without a clear view of his features, Cole knew this had to be Harlan Bridgewater. The other 2 men were different types entirely. One was thick-set and brutal-looking, with the kind of scarred hands that came from years of violence. The other was lean and nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting trouble. Neither looked like the sort who worried much about the finer points of law and order. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to be heard but far enough to avoid an easy shot. Bridgewater called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Cole Merrick, I know you're in there. We need to talk." Cole opened the cabin door but stayed in the doorway, his rifle held casually but ready. "Evening, Bridgewater. Little late for social calls, isn't it?" "This isn't a social call." Bridgewater urged his horse a few steps closer. "I'm here on official business. I have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive." "Is that so? What kind of fugitive?" "A thief. A woman named Annie Calder who stole money from my household before disappearing into the storm. Sheriff Dawson's issued a warrant for her arrest." Cole stepped fully out onto the porch, letting the moonlight illuminate his face so Bridgewater could see his expression. "Well now, that's interesting. See, there's no Annie Calder here. Don't play games with me, Merrick. We tracked her here. You tracked someone here, maybe, but the only woman in this cabin is my wife, Mrs. Annie Merrick. We were married this evening by Reverend Hayes, all legal and proper." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Cole could see Bridgewater's jaw working, his horse stamping restlessly beneath him. The man to his left, the thick-set one, had his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "That's not possible," Bridgewater said finally. Annie Calder died in the storm. That is, we have reliable reports that she perished in the blizzard. A funny thing about reports, Cole said mildly. Sometimes they turn out to be wrong. Sometimes what folks think happened and what actually happened are two different things entirely. The nervous man spoke up for the first time. Maybe we should go back to town, Mr. Bridgewater, if they're married legal. Shut up, Morrison. Bridgewater's voice cracked like a whip. I don't care if she's married to the president himself, and she's still a thief, and she's going to face justice. Cole's grip tightened on his rifle. Seems to me the only thieves around here are the ones who steal a pregnant woman's wages and then try to murder her for sport. How dare you? Bridgewater's face flushed red with anger. That woman was a corrupting influence on decent folk. What we did was necessary to protect the moral fabric of our community. What you did, Cole said, his voice going dangerously quiet, was tie a pregnant woman to a fence post in a blizzard and leave her to die. Where I come from, we call that attempted murder. The thick-set man had drawn his pistol now, though he kept it pointed down. You callin' Mr. Bridgewater a murderer? I'm calling him exactly what he is. Cole raised his rifle slightly, not quite aiming but making his intentions clear. And I'm telling all three of you to get off my land before this conversation turns unfriendly. Your land? Bridgewater laughed harshly. You think a piece of paper from some government clerk gives you the right to harbor criminals? I've got friends in the territorial capital, Merrick, friends who can make your life very difficult. Maybe so, but right now, tonight, you're trespassing on my property and threatening my wife. That makes this a local matter, not a territorial one. Behind him, Cole heard the soft creak of floorboards. Annie had come to the door, though she stayed in the shadows where the men couldn't see her clearly. Cole, she said quietly, then let me talk to them. No. You're my wife now, Annie, this is my fight. But Annie stepped forward into the moonlight, and Cole heard Bridgewater's sharp intake of breath. Even with the bruises mostly healed and dressed in clean clothes, her recent ordeal was still visible in the careful way she moved, the fading marks on her face. Mr. Bridgewater, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. You left me to die. You tied me to that fence post and rode away, thinking you'd never have to face the consequences of what you'd done. You brought it on yourself, Bridgewater snarled. A decent woman wouldn't have found herself in such circumstances. A decent woman trusted a man who told her he loved her, Annie replied. A decent woman believed promises that turned out to be lies, and decent men don't punish women for the sins of others. The nervous man, Morrison, was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Bridgewater, maybe we should... I said shut up. Bridgewater's hand moved to his own weapon. That woman is coming back to town with us, marriage or no marriage. She's going to face charges for theft, and she's going to serve as an example to other women who might be tempted to stray from the path of righteousness. The only place she's going, Cole said, his voice carrying a deadly calm, is back inside this cabin with her husband. And the only people leaving here tonight are the three of you. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 armed men against 1. But Cole had the advantage of position and the desperate determination of a man protecting his family. The thick-set gunman was clearly eager for violence, his weapon now half raised. Morrison looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. It was Bridgewater who blinked first. Perhaps he'd seen something in Cole's eyes that reminded him this wasn't a shopkeeper or farmer he was facing. Perhaps he'd simply calculated the odds and decided they weren't in his favor. This isn't over, Merrick, he said, pulling his horse around. You think that marriage protects her, but I've got lawyers who'll find ways around it. I've got friends who'll make sure you both regret this night. Could be, Cole replied. But before you start making threats, you might want to ask around town about my time in the army. Ask about what happened at Fort Kearny or why I left the service when I did. Might give you some perspective on what you're up against. Something in Cole's tone must have struck home, because Bridgewater's bluster faded slightly. He turned to his companions. Come on. We're done here for tonight. The thick-set man holstered his weapon reluctantly. You sure, boss? 3 of us. One of him? I said we're leaving. Bridgewater's voice brooked no argument. But this isn't finished. Merrick, not by a long shot. They rode away into the darkness. But Cole didn't relax until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Only then did he lower his rifle and turn to Annie, who was standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself. You all right? He asked. I should be asking you that question. Annie's voice was shaky but determined. They could have killed you, Cole. All for me. Not just for you, for us, for our family. Cole reached out and took her hand. That's what marriage means. Annie. Standing together against whatever comes, Annie felt tears prick her eyes. What did you mean about Fort Kearny? What happened there? Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring out into the darkness where their visitors had disappeared. Nothing I'm proud of, he said finally. But sometimes a man has to do things he'd rather not, to protect what matters to him. He guided her back inside and secured the door, checking the locks and making sure the rifle was within easy reach. The cabin felt smaller now, more vulnerable, but it was still theirs. Still home. Will they come back? Annie asked. Maybe, probably. Bridgewater's not the type to give up easy, and I just embarrassed him in front of his men. That's dangerous for a man like him. Annie sank into one of the chairs, suddenly exhausted. I've brought nothing but trouble into your life, haven't I? Cole knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Annie, look at me. You haven't brought trouble, you've brought purpose. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions of living. Now I have something to fight for, something to protect. That's not trouble, that's a gift. But if something happens to you, nothing's going to happen to me, Cole said firmly. I've survived worse than Harlan Bridgewater and his hired guns, and now I've got even more reason to make sure I keep surviving. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the shutters and moaning around the cabin walls. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, a man and woman sat together, planning for whatever tomorrow might bring. They were married now, bound together by law and growing affection, facing an uncertain future with quiet determination. The confrontation was over for tonight, but Cole knew it was just the beginning. Bridgewater wouldn't give up easily, and men with his kind of power and pride were dangerous when cornered. But Annie was his wife now, legally and truly, and that changed everything. He'd made promises before God and man, and Cole Merrick was not the kind of man who broke his word. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as husband and wife, as family. Part 6, Healing and Names. The days following the confrontation passed with a strange mix of tension and growing contentment. Cole maintained his vigilance, never venturing far from the cabin without his rifle, always listening for the sound of approaching horses. But as February melted into March and no further threats materialized, the atmosphere in their small home began to settle into something resembling normalcy. Annie threw herself into the work of making the cabin truly livable. She mended curtains and made new ones from fabric Cole bought on his weekly trips to town, transformed his sparse bachelor quarters into something that felt like a real home. She planted herbs in small pots on the windowsill, hung dried flowers from the rafters, and somehow made the rough-hewn furniture look comfortable and welcoming. Cole found himself looking forward to coming home in ways he never had before. The sight of lamplight glowing in the windows, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the sound of Annie humming as she worked. These small domestic pleasures filled a void in his life he hadn't even realized existed. Their marriage remained chaste by mutual, unspoken agreement. Cole continued to sleep by the fire while Annie occupied the bedroom, though they'd grown comfortable enough with each other to share meals, conversation, and the quiet companionship of two people learning to build a life together. There was attraction between them. Cole would have been blind not to notice Annie's grace, the way lamplight caught in her dark hair, the gentle swell of her growing belly. But he was determined to let her set the pace, to never pressure her for more than she was ready to give. Annie, for her part, found herself studying her husband when she thought he wasn't looking. The way his hands moved with sure competence, whether he was mending harness or splitting wood. The quiet strength in his voice when he spoke to the animals. The patience he showed when teaching her to shoot his old revolver. She'd married him for protection, but she was beginning to understand she'd gotten something far more valuable. A true partner. 3 weeks after their wedding. Cole came home from checking his trap lines to find Annie sitting at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face. His heart lurched, thinking something had happened to the baby. But when she looked up at him, her expression was one of wonder rather than distress. "The baby moved," she said softly, her hands pressed to her belly. "Really moved, not just the little flutters I've been feeling. I think it's going to be all right." Cole set down his rifle and moved to her side, his own heart racing. "Can I?" He gestured toward her belly, and she nodded, taking his hand and placing it where she could feel the movement strongest. They sat in silence for several minutes, waiting. And then Cole felt it, a distinct push against his palm, as if the baby were announcing its presence to the world. His face broke into a grin so wide it made Annie laugh despite her tears. "Strong little thing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Takes after its mother." "Its father," Annie corrected quietly. "You're going to be this baby's father in every way that matters. Cole, I want you to know that." Cole felt something settle in his chest, a sense of belonging and purpose that he'd never experienced before. "Have you thought about names?" Annie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "A little. I keep thinking about new beginnings, fresh starts. Maybe something that reflects that." "Dawn," Cole suggested. "If it's a girl. Or maybe Hope." "Hope," Annie repeated, testing the sound of it. "Hope, Merrick? I like that." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "And if it's a boy?" "That's harder. Something strong but not too fancy." Cole thought for a moment. "Maybe Daniel? It means judged by God, and seems like this little one's already been through that particular trial." Annie nodded, her hand still covering his on her belly. "Daniel Merrick, that has a good sound to it." They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin, and Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. But this time the visitor was familiar, Sheriff Marcus Dawson, riding alone and looking decidedly uncomfortable. Cole stepped out onto the porch to meet him, noting that Dawson kept his hands visible and made no move toward his weapon. The sheriff was a small, nervous man in his 50s, with thinning hair and the soft look of someone who'd spent too many years behind a desk. "Afternoon, Cole," Dawson said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mind if I step down? We need to talk." "Talk about what?" "Your wife, and certain allegations that have been made." Cole's jaw tightened, but he nodded toward the hitching post. "Light and sit. Coffee's on." Dawson dismounted and followed Cole into the cabin, removing his hat respectfully when he saw Annie. She was still sitting at the table, but she'd composed herself and offered the sheriff a polite nod. "Mrs. Merrick," Dawson said carefully, "you're looking well." "Thank you, Sheriff. Would you like some coffee?" As Annie busied herself with the coffee pot, Dawson settled into one of the chairs and cleared his throat nervously. "Cole, I'll be straight with you. Harlan Bridgewater's been pressing me to arrest your wife on charges of theft. Says she stole $50 from his household safe before disappearing." "And what do you think about those charges?" Cole asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I think," Dawson said carefully, "that Mr. Bridgewater's been telling different versions of this story every time I talk to him. First it was $20, then 30, now 50. And the timing keeps changing too." Annie set a cup of coffee in front of the sheriff, her hand steady despite the tension in the room. "I never stole anything from the Bridgewaters. Sheriff, I worked for them honestly for 2 years, and when they dismissed me, I took nothing but the wages they owed me, which was considerably less than what they claimed they'd paid." Dawson studied her face, then looked at Cole. "Here's the thing. Even if I believed Mr. and Bridgewater's story, which I'm finding harder to do every day, pursuing charges against a married woman is complicated. Legally speaking, Mrs. Merrick is under her husband's protection now. Any debts or alleged crimes from before the marriage become a civil matter between families, not a criminal one." "Meaning?" Cole prompted. "Meaning I don't have grounds to arrest her. And I've told Mr. Bridgewater as much." Dawson took a sip of coffee, gathering his courage. "There's something else you should know. I've been asking around town about what really happened the night Mrs. Merrick disappeared. Found a few people willing to talk now that she's safely married and under your protection." Annie's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "What did they say?" "Enough to make me very interested in having a long talk with Mr. Bridgewater and his friends about their activities that night. Seems there were witnesses to things that didn't make it into the official reports." Cole leaned forward. "What kind of witnesses?" "The kind that saw 3 men drag a woman out of the church and ride toward the old Hutchins place. The kind that heard shouting and saw her tied up before the storm hit full force." Dawson's voice hardened. "The kind that make a man realize he's been told lies about what really happened that night." Annie covered her face with her hands, and Cole reached over to squeeze her shoulder supportively. "What are you planning to do about it?" Cole asked. "Officially? Not much I can do without Mrs. Merrick filing formal charges, and I understand why she might be reluctant to do that." Dawson met Cole's eyes meaningfully. "Unofficially? Let's just say that Mr. Bridgewater and I are going to have several very frank conversations about the future of law enforcement in this county." Cole nodded, understanding the subtext. Dawson might be in Bridgewater's pocket financially, but he wasn't comfortable with attempted murder, and he certainly wasn't going to let it happen again. "There's one more thing," Dawson continued. "I brought this for you, Mrs. Merrick." He reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. "It's a copy of your marriage certificate, properly filed with the territorial government. Thought you might want to have it on hand, just in case anyone else decides to question your status." Annie took the document with trembling hands, staring at the official seal and her new name written in formal script. "Thank you," she whispered. "No need for thanks. It's my job to make sure the law protects decent folks, not the other way around." Dawson stood to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Cole, word of advice from an old friend. You might want to stay close to home for a while. Mr. Bridgewater's not the type to give up easily, and he's got friends who don't much care about legal niceties." After the sheriff left, Cole and Annie sat in thoughtful silence. The official recognition of their marriage felt like a milestone, but they both understood it was just another layer of protection in what remained a dangerous situation. "Hey, do you regret it?" Annie asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean, all this trouble could have been avoided if you'd just sent me away that first night." Cole turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Annie, I want you to listen to me very carefully. The only thing I regret is that it took a blizzard and a near tragedy to bring you into my life. Everything else, the confrontation with Bridgewater, the threats, the complications, none of that matters compared to what we're building here." Annie felt tears threatening again. "I don't know how you can say that. You barely know me." "I know enough." Cole reached across the table and took her hand. "I know you're brave enough to protect your child even when you thought you were dying. I know you're honest enough to tell hard truths even when they might hurt you. I know you're strong enough to start over and build something new. And I know that having you and this baby in my life has made me happier than I've been in years." "Really?" "Really." Cole smiled, and Annie felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Besides, someone's got to teach this little one how to ride and shoot and handle cattle. Might as well be me." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Cole disappeared into the bedroom and returned with something wrapped in soft cloth. He handed it to Annie with an expression that was part nervous, part hopeful. "What is it?" she asked, carefully unwrapping the bundle. Inside was a small wooden sign, carefully carved and sanded smooth, in neat, precise letters. It read, "Annie Merrick." "I made it for you," Cole said, suddenly shy. "Thought you might like to have something with your new name on it. Your real name." Annie traced the letters with her fingertip, feeling the care that had gone into each curve and line. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But what's it for?" "The garden," Cole said. "Spring's coming, and I thought you might want to plant some vegetables behind the cabin. Every proper homestead needs a garden, and every garden needs a sign showing who tends it." Annie looked up at him. This man who'd married her to protect her, who'd defended her against armed men, who'd just spent hours carving her name into wood as if she were something precious worth commemorating. "Cole," she said softly. "Yes? I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and simple and true. Cole felt his heart skip a beat, but when he reached for her, it was with the same gentle patience he'd shown from the beginning. "I've been hoping you might," he said, gathering her into his arms. "Because I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you in that storm." Their first real kiss was soft and sweet, full of promise rather than demand. When they broke apart, Annie rested her forehead against his, both of them smiling. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we keep building," Cole said simply. "One day at a time, one decision at a time, together, outside." The March wind whistled around the cabin, but inside, a man and woman sat planning their garden and their future, their child's name and their shared dreams. They'd started as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but they were becoming something far more precious, a family, bound not just by law and necessity, but by growing love and shared hope for tomorrow. The little wooden sign with Annie's name sat on the table between them, waiting for spring and the garden it would mark. But more than that, it was a symbol of belonging, of permanence, of a life they were building together one careful step at a time. Annie Merrick, wife, mother-to-be, home. For the first time in her life, all of those words felt true. Part 7, Spring Blooms. Spring came early to the Montana Territory that year, arriving with an urgency that seemed to mirror the new life growing inside Annie. By late April, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving behind a world washed clean and green with possibility. The creek that ran behind their cabin sang with snowmelt, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant splashes of color that took Annie's breath away. The baby was due any day now. Dr. Benjamin Carson had told them during his monthly visits to the homestead. The elderly physician had been making the long ride from town since March. Ever since Millicent Whitmore had cornered him at the general store and made it clear that Annie Merrick would receive proper medical care regardless of what certain influential citizens might prefer. That woman's been through enough, Millie had declared in her no-nonsense way. And Cole Merrick's as decent a man as ever drew breath. If you won't tend to his wife, Ben Carson, then you're not the man I thought you were. Dr. Carson, who'd delivered half the babies in the territory and had strong opinions about the sacred nature of his calling, had needed little convincing. He'd been appalled to learn what had really happened to Annie that winter night, and he'd made it his personal mission to ensure she had the safest delivery possible. Everything looks fine, he'd told them during his last visit, his weathered hands gentle as he examined Annie. Babies positioned well, heartbeat strong, should be an easy birth, God willing. Now, as Annie stood in the doorway of their cabin watching Cole work in the garden they'd planted together, she felt a complex mix of anticipation and anxiety. The man who'd married her to save her life had become so much more than a husband in name only. Over the long winter months, they'd grown into true partners, sharing not just a home but dreams and fears, laughter and quiet conversations by the fire. Their physical relationship had developed slowly, carefully, with Cole never pushing for more than Annie was ready to give. The first time she'd kissed him with real passion. It had been she who initiated it, she who'd taken his hand and led him to their bedroom on a night when the April rain drummed against the windows and the world felt intimate and safe. Their lovemaking had been tender rather than desperate, careful rather than wild. And afterward, as they lay entwined in the narrow bed, Annie had understood for the first time what it meant to truly belong to someone who belonged equally to her. "I love you," she'd whispered into the darkness, and Cole's arms had tightened around her. "I love you too," he'd replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." Now, watching him work in the soil they'd prepared together, Annie marveled at how completely her life had changed. The garden was thriving under Cole's patient care, neat rows of beans and corn, tomatoes and squash, herbs and flowers all growing strong in the mountain sunshine. He'd built a small fence around it to keep the rabbits out, and hung Annie's carved name sign on the gate with obvious pride. "Mrs. Annie Merrick's garden," he'd said when he'd finished the installation. "Finest spread in the territory." A sharp pain across her belly made Annie gasp and reach for the doorframe. She'd been having similar pains on and off for the past few days, but this one was stronger, more insistent. As she caught her breath, she felt a warm wetness between her legs and understood with sudden clarity that their waiting was over. "Hey, Cole," she called, trying to keep her voice calm. "Cole, I think you'd better come inside." He looked up from the carrots he was thinning, saw her expression, and was on his feet immediately. "The baby?" "I think so. My water just broke." Cole's face went pale, but his movements were sure and steady as he dropped his tools and hurried to her side. "Are you all right? Do you need to lie down?" "I'm fine for now," Annie said, though another contraction was already building. "But you'd better ride for Doctor and Carson and ask Millie to come too. I'm going to need help." Cole helped her inside and settled her in their bedroom, his hands gentle but his eyes worried. "I don't want to leave you alone. You have to. The doctor needs time to get here, and Millie knows more about birthing babies than both of us put together." Annie managed a smile despite the tightening in her belly. "I'll be fine. Cole, Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Not my woman, Cole said fiercely. Not my baby. The possessive tenderness in his voice made Annie's heart swell. This child would never doubt that it was wanted, loved, claimed by the man who'd chosen to be its father. Cole saddled Prudence in record time and rode hard for town, his mind racing with all the things that could go wrong. He'd seen animals give birth countless times, but this was different. This was Annie. This was their child, and the thought of losing either of them made his chest tight with fear. He found Dr. Carson at his office, just finishing with a patient who'd cut his hand on a broken bottle. The physician took one look at Cole's face and began gathering his supplies. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked as he packed his medical bag. "I don't know. She'd only had a couple when I left." Cole ran a hand through his hair. "Is that bad? Should they be closer together?" "Easy, son. First babies take their time. We'll likely have ours yet." Dr. Carson shouldered his bag and headed for the door. "Did you send for Millicent?" "I'm going there next." Good. That woman's got more sense in her little finger than most people have in their whole bodies. Your wife's going to be fine, Cole. I promise you that." Cole found Millie in her kitchen, kneading bread for the next day's baking. She took one look at his face and began untying her apron. "Annie?" she asked simply. "The baby's coming. Dr. Carson's already on his way to the cabin." "About time," Millie said with satisfaction. "That child's been making its presence known for weeks now. I'll just gather a few things and be right along." By the time Cole returned to the cabin with Millie, Dr. Carson had already examined Annie and pronounced everything progressing normally. The contractions were stronger now, coming every few minutes, and Annie was walking around the main room with Millie's encouraging support. "Walking helps move things along," Millie explained to Cole, who looked like he wanted to wrap Annie in cotton wool and make her lie down immediately. "Let her do what feels right. Her body knows what it's doing." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Carson set up his instruments and prepared clean linens while Millie boiled water and made Annie comfortable. Cole felt largely useless, hovering anxiously until Millie finally gave him specific tasks, keeping the fire going, heating water, preparing food that none of them would have time to eat. As the afternoon wore on, Annie's labor intensified. She gripped Cole's hand during the worst contractions, her face pale but determined. Between pains, she managed to joke and even laugh, her courage humbling everyone in the room. "This baby's going to be stubborn," she gasped after a particularly strong contraction. "Takes after its father, or its mother," Cole replied, smoothing her sweat-dampened hair back from her forehead. "You're the strongest person I know, Annie. You can do this." As evening approached, Dr. Carson announced that it was time. Annie's contractions were coming fast and hard now, and she could no longer walk through them. Cole helped her to their bedroom, where Millie had prepared everything for the birth. "I want Cole to stay," Annie said when the doctor suggested her husband might be more comfortable waiting in the other room. "Are you sure?" Dr. Carson asked. "Birthing can be difficult for men to watch." "He's not just any man," Annie said firmly. "He's this baby's father, and I want him here." Cole positioned himself beside the bed, holding Annie's hand and whispering words of encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. When Dr. Carson finally announced, "I can see the head," Cole felt tears spring to his eyes. 2 more contractions, and then suddenly there was a rush of movement, a slippery warmth, and the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. "It's a boy," Dr. Carson announced, holding up a red-faced, squalling infant. "A fine, healthy boy." Cole looked down at Annie, who was crying and laughing at the same time. Then at the tiny person Dr. Carson was cleaning and wrapping in soft blankets. When the physician placed the baby in Annie's arms, Cole felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a fierce, protective love unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "Hello, Daniel," Annie whispered to the baby, who had stopped crying and was looking around with dark, serious eyes. "Hello, little one?" Daniel Merrick," Cole said softly, testing the sound of it. His son, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by every way that mattered. "Welcome to the family, boy." Dr. Carson finished his examinations and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. "Fine work, Mrs. Merrick," he said with genuine warmth. "You've got a strong one there. Good lungs, good reflexes, perfect in every way." Millie bustled around, cleaning up and preparing a meal for the exhausted new parents. As she worked, she regaled them with stories of other births she'd attended, each tale designed to reassure and entertain. "You did better than most," she told Annie as she tucked clean sheets around her. "Some women carry on like the world's ending. You just got down to business and got it done." As night fell, Dr. Carson packed his instruments and prepared to leave. He'd stay the night at Millie's place and check on Annie and the baby again in the morning before returning to town. "Any problems at all, you send for me immediately," he instructed Cole. "But I don't expect any. That's a strong baby, and Annie's recovered beautifully." After their visitors left, Cole and Annie were alone with their son for the first time. The baby was sleeping peacefully in Annie's arms, his tiny fists curled against his cheeks, completely unaware of the complicated circumstances that had brought him into the world. "He's perfect," Cole said, his voice full of wonder. "He is," Annie agreed, "and he's ours." Cole reached out tentatively to touch the baby's soft cheek. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A family. A real family." "Neither did I." Annie looked up at her husband, this good man who'd saved her life and given her everything she'd ever dreamed of having. "But here we are." "Here we are," Cole agreed. He leaned down to kiss first Annie, then the baby's forehead. "I love you both more than I have words for." Outside their window, the spring night was soft and warm, full of the promise of summer to come. Inside the cabin, a new family settled into the rhythm of life together, feeding, sleeping, the quiet murmur of voices planning for tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. The child who'd been conceived in shame and nearly lost to violence had been born into love, claimed by a father who'd chosen him freely and surrounded by people who would protect and cherish him always. Daniel Merrick would grow up knowing he was wanted, knowing he belonged, knowing that sometimes the best families were the ones people built for themselves through choice and commitment rather than chance. As Annie drifted off to sleep with the baby nestled against her side and Cole's strong hand resting protectively over both of them, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had been a hard road, full of pain and fear and moments when hope seemed impossible. But it had led here, to this perfect night, this perfect family, this perfect beginning. In the garden outside, the flowers Cole had planted were blooming in the darkness, their sweet scent drifting through the open window. And on the gate, Annie's name sign stood proud and permanent in the moonlight, marking not just a garden but a home, a life, a love story that had grown from the coldest winter into the warmest spring anyone could imagine. The Merrick family was complete. Part 8, Promises Without Rings. Summer arrived in the Montana territory with a warmth that seemed to bless everything it touched. The Merrick homestead had transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale, the garden flourishing under Annie's loving care. Wildflowers blooming in riotous color around the cabin and baby Daniel growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. At 3 months old, Daniel was a happy, curious child with his mother's gray eyes and what Cole swore was his own stubborn chin. He'd taken to ranch life as if he'd been born to it, sleeping peacefully through the sounds of cattle lowing and horses whinnying, gurgling with delight when Cole carried him out to see the animals. "He's going to be a natural rancher," Cole said one evening as he held the baby on the front porch, pointing out the different stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Look how he watches everything like he's trying to figure out how it all works." Annie smiled from her chair beside them, mending one of Cole's shirts in the fading light. "Maybe he'll be a scholar instead. Have you seen how he stares at books when I'm reading?" "It could be both," Cole said diplomatically. "Smart enough for learning, strong enough for ranch work. Best of all worlds." The peaceful domesticity of their life together still amazed Annie sometimes. 6 months ago, she'd been sleeping in a church cellar, facing an uncertain future with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby she wasn't sure she could protect. Now she had a home, a husband who loved her, a thriving garden, and a child who would never know want or abandonment. Word of the baby's birth had spread through the community with the kind of speed that only good news seemed to achieve. Neighbors who'd been wary of the circumstances surrounding the Merrick's sudden marriage had softened when they saw Cole's obvious devotion to both Annie and Daniel. There was something undeniably heartwarming about watching the formerly solitary rancher dote on his infant son, carrying the baby with him on his daily rounds and talking to him in the gentle voice usually reserved for spooked horses. Even some of the townspeople had begun to accept the new reality. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had sent a beautiful baby quilt with her congratulations. The blacksmith's wife had dropped off a basket of preserves and stayed for coffee, chatting comfortably with Annie about the challenges of keeping a home in frontier country. But it was Millicent Whitmore who'd become their most stalwart ally, and Annie's closest friend. The older woman visited at least twice a week, sometimes to help with the baby, sometimes just to sit on the porch and share the latest news from town. She'd appointed herself unofficial grandmother to Daniel and defender of the Merrick family's reputation, and woe to anyone who dared suggest otherwise in her presence. "That woman's a treasure," Annie said one afternoon after Millie had departed with promises to return the next day with fresh bread and more stories about her wild youth. "I don't know what we'd do without her." "He probably managed just fine," Cole replied, "but it wouldn't be nearly as interesting." They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Daniel sleeping peacefully in Annie's arms. These quiet evening hours had become their favorite time of day. The work done, the baby content, the world settling into peaceful shadows around them. "Cole?" Annie said softly, her voice carrying a note of something he couldn't quite identify. "Yes? Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night? If you'd just stayed with the cattle and ignored the sound in the storm?" Cole considered the question seriously. It wasn't the first time she'd asked something like this, and he'd learned that her occasional need to revisit that night wasn't born of regret but of wonder, the kind of amazement that came from understanding how narrow the margin had been between tragedy and salvation. "I think about it sometimes," he said honestly, "but not in the way you might expect." "What do you mean?" "I don't think about what would have happened to you, because I can't bear to imagine that," Cole said, his voice low and serious. "I think about what would have happened to me, how I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I'd heard someone in trouble and chosen not to help, how empty this place would be without you and Daniel, how lonely I'd have been without even knowing what I was missing." Annie felt tears prick her eyes, even after all these months. Cole's capacity for making her feel precious and wanted could catch her off guard. "I used to think that night was the worst thing that ever happened to me," she said. being tied to that fence post, thinking I was going to die, wondering what would happen to my baby. But now I think it might have been the best thing. How's that? Because it brought me to you. To this. She gestured at their home, their life, the peaceful scene around them. I never would have had the courage to leave the Bridgewaters on my own, even after everything that happened. I would have just endured, I suppose, taken whatever scraps of life they were willing to give me. Cole reached over and took her free hand, intertwining their fingers. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Annie. You would have found a way, maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. Annie looked down at Daniel, who was making the soft little sounds that meant he was dreaming. Do you think he'll ask about his birth father someday, when he's older? Probably, Cole said without hesitation. And when he does, we'll tell him the truth. That his birth father was a man who wasn't worthy of the gift he was given, and that his real father, the one who chose him, who raised him, who loved him from his first breath, is the only father that matters. Annie's heart swelled with love for this man who'd claimed her child so completely, so unreservedly. And if Thomas Garrett ever comes around, tries to assert some claim, Cole's expression hardened slightly. Thomas Garrett had his chance to be a father. He chose to walk away. As far as the law is concerned, Daniel is my son. As far as I'm concerned, he always was. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Daniel stirred in Annie's arms, and she rose to take him inside for his evening feeding. Cole followed, banking the fire and checking the door locks, habits from their more dangerous days that he'd never quite abandoned. As Annie settled into the rocking chair Cole had made for her, Daniel latching contentedly, Cole found himself marveling once again at the picture they made. His wife, his son, his home. 6 months ago, these words would have been foreign to him. Now they were the foundation of everything he cared about. Annie, he said suddenly, the words seeming to come from somewhere deep in his chest. She looked up from the baby, her face soft in the lamplight. I know we got married for practical reasons. Protection, security, giving Daniel a name. And I know you've grown to care for me. Maybe even love me. More than maybe, Annie said softly. But I want you to know something. Cole moved to kneel beside her chair, his hands covering hers where they supported the baby. What I feel for you, it's not gratitude or responsibility or even just love. It's everything. You and Daniel are my whole world now. I can't imagine existence without you. Annie felt her breath catch. Cole, I'm not saying this to pressure you or because I expect anything in return. He continued. I just needed you to know, if I had all the money in the world, if I could give you the finest house and the most expensive clothes and all the jewelry a woman could want, I'd still consider myself the luckier one in this marriage. Annie set down the cloth she'd been using to burp Daniel and reached out to cup Cole's face in her palm. Do you want to know a secret? Always. I don't want the finest house or expensive clothes or jewelry, she said, her voice tender with emotion. I want exactly this cabin, this life, this man who makes me feel like the most precious thing in his world. I want the husband who carved my name into a piece of wood like it was something worth celebrating. I want the father who talks to our son about the stars and carries him to see the horses and looks at him like he hung the moon. Cole turned his head to kiss her palm. You have all of that, forever, if you want it. I do want it, forever and always. Annie leaned down to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. Cole Merrick, you are the best man I've ever known, and loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done. Daniel chose that moment to let out a small burp, followed by a contented sigh that made both his parents laugh. Even he approves, Annie said, smiling down at their son. Cole stood and held out his arms, and Annie transferred the sleepy baby to him. He held Daniel against his chest, swaying slightly in the unconscious rhythm that had become second nature. "You know what I was thinking today?" Cole said as they moved toward the bedroom. "What?" "That maybe it's time to think about expanding the cabin. I mean, adding on a room or two." Annie paused in the doorway. "Are you expecting this house to get more crowded?" Cole's cheeks reddened slightly. "Well, Daniel's going to need his own room eventually, and maybe someday he'd like a brother or sister to keep him company." Annie felt warmth spread through her chest at the thought. More children, more love, more of this perfect life they'd built together. "I think that sounds wonderful," she said softly. "But for now, I like having him close." They settled Daniel in the small cradle Cole had built, watching as he drifted into deeper sleep. Then, finally alone for the first time since morning, they turned to each other with the easy intimacy of a couple who'd learned to read each other's moods and needs. "Come here, Mrs. Merrick," Cole said, his voice low and warm. "Yes, Mr. Merrick," Annie replied, moving into his arms with a smile. Their lovemaking that night was tender and passionate, filled with the deep contentment that came from knowing they belonged to each other completely. Afterward, as they lay entwined in their narrow bed, Annie traced patterns on Cole's chest with her fingertip. "Hey, Cole?" "Thank you." "For what?" "Hey, for giving me your name," Annie said quietly. "Not just legally, but really, for making me feel like I deserve to carry it." Cole tightened his arms around her. "Annie, you don't just carry my name. You've made it mean something. Before you, I was just Cole Merrick, bachelor rancher, nobody special. Now I'm Cole Merrick, husband and father, the luckiest man in Montana Territory." Outside their window, the night was soft and warm, filled with the gentle sounds of summer, crickets chirping, wind rustling through the grass, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Inside, a family slept peacefully, secure in their love for each other and their faith in the future they were building together. The little wooden sign with Annie's name still marked their garden gate, but it had become something more than a marker for vegetables and flowers. It was a symbol of belonging, of home, of the truth that sometimes the most beautiful things in life grew from the darkest soil. Annie Merrick, wife, mother, beloved. The name fitted her perfectly, and would for all the years to come. In the cradle beside their bed, Daniel slept peacefully, dreaming baby dreams and completely unaware that he was the luckiest child in the territory, claimed by love, raised by choice, and surrounded by people who would move mountains to keep him safe and happy. This was their family. This was their home. This was their happily ever after. Built not on fairy tale magic, but on the much stronger foundation of everyday kindness, genuine love, and the courage to choose each other again and again, one day at a time. And it was more than enough. It was everything.